She spent 30 years building something real, my mother announced to the entire room, one hand resting on my sister-in-law's shoulder like she was presenting a trophy she'd personally commissioned. And then there's Nora. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The pause she left behind did exactly the work she'd designed it to do. 47 people in my brother's living room went quiet all at once. Extended family, neighbors, my brother's colleagues from the hospital, people I'd met maybe twice in my life. Every single one of them turned to look at me. My mother had been rehearsing that pause for years. I could tell by the way her chin lifted exactly half an inch after she said my name. That's what a practiced silence looks like. It has posture. Standing beside her was my sister-in-law, Delia, director of a nonprofit that had just been featured in the Wall Street Journal. 42 years old, 2 master's degrees, a TEDx talk with a thumbnail so polished it looked like a movie poster. My mother had been collecting Delia's accomplishments the way other women collect ceramic figurines, arranging them carefully on mental shelves, and pointing at them whenever company came over. I was the company this time. I stood near the kitchen doorway holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't sipped in 20 minutes, wearing the blazer I'd driven 4 hours to be presentable in, and absorbed the familiar shape of my mother's contempt in front of everyone my brother cared about impressing. My name is Nora. I am 41 years old. I own a small accounting firm in Eastern Tennessee that handles tax compliance for rural healthcare clinics, independent pharmacies, and community health centers across 3 states. I am not a director of anything. I do not have a TEDx thumbnail. I have a beige office with 1 window and a coffee maker that takes 4 minutes longer than it should. That is what my mother saw when she looked at me. What she did not see, what she had never once in my life taken the trouble to see, was the number on the desk of the woman running the financing arm of Delia's nonprofit. Her name was Constance Briggs, Chief Financial Officer. She had been in the room for the last 20 minutes. And when my mother said my name the way she said it, Constance Briggs set down her wine glass, turned to look at me, and went completely still. But before I tell you what happened in the next 4 minutes that took apart everything my mother had built in that room over the last decade, and who paid the price for it, stay with me. Because you need to understand how we got here. How a woman can spend 30 years deciding her daughter is background noise. And what happens the day the background decides it's done being quiet. My mother's name is Patricia. She grew up in Knoxville, married my father at 23, had my brother first, then me 2 years later, and spent the next 4 decades making sure we all understood the difference. Not in ugly ways, never in ugly ways. Patricia doesn't do ugly, she does precise. She does considered. She does the kind of cruelty that doesn't leave a mark you can point to, only a bruise you can feel when you press on it. My brother Garrett was the plan. I was the footnote. I understood this by the time I was 8. The understanding arrived slowly, the way cold does when you don't notice it until you're already shivering. It wasn't any single event. It was the accumulation of small adjustments. The way my father's eyes went to Garrett first when something good happened. The way my mother rearranged the frames on the mantel so Garrett's school portrait was always the one facing the front door. The way, when I came home with a 94 on a math test, she said, "That's fine, sweetheart." And when Garrett came home with an 88, she said, "We should celebrate. What do you want for dinner?" I was 11 when I overheard the phone call. My mother was in the kitchen. I was sitting on the 3rd stair from the bottom, the one that didn't creak, the one I'd learned to sit on specifically because conversations continued when I was there. She was talking to my aunt. Her voice was the warm version, the one she used with people she was performing ease for. "Garrett's going to be a doctor, I know it. I can feel it." A pause, the sound of a cabinet opening and closing. "Nora, she'll be fine. She'll find something. Some girls are just meant to support the people who do the real work." I sat on that stair for a long time after the call ended. I didn't cry. Crying felt like giving her something. Instead, I went up to my room, opened the spiral notebook I kept in the back of my closet behind the winter sweaters, and wrote down 2 words at the top of a blank page. Watch me. That notebook lived behind those sweaters for the next 7 years. Every time my mother redirected an adult's attention away from me and toward Garrett, every time a relative asked what I planned to do with my life, and she answered for me with something vague while she had a precise and detailed answer ready for his. Every time she rearranged the room so I was standing at the edge of the frame, I wrote it down, all of it. 2 words at the top of the page, and then the date, and then what happened. It was a list. And lists, in my line of work, are the beginning of everything. My father was not a cruel man. He was an absent one, which is sometimes worse because at least cruelty notices you. He traveled for work, regional sales, medical equipment, and when he was home, he was tired in the specific way of men who have spent decades moving through the world at a speed that doesn't leave room for the quiet things. He looked at me sometimes with an expression I could never name. Not regret, not apology, Something closer to resignation, like a man who sees the unfairness of a situation and has already decided he doesn't have the energy to address it. The one time I remember him acting, I was 17. I had applied to the University of Tennessee's accounting program. I'd found the application myself, filled it out myself, asked my guidance counselor to mail my transcript, because I knew better than to ask my mother to handle anything related to my future. The acceptance letter came on a Tuesday. I carried it home in my backpack for 3 hours before I opened it at the kitchen table. My mother read it over my shoulder, set it back down, and said, "Accounting, that's a support role." She said it the way you'd describe a weather condition. Not angry, not unkind, just factual. That's a support role. As if I had announced I planned to be a parking attendant, and she was gently orienting me to the terrain. She left the room. I sat at the table for a long time. The letter was still open in front of me. I'd gotten in. I'd done it by myself, without help, without anyone driving me to a campus visit or reviewing my essay or asking how the application was going. I'd gotten in, and the first response from the person who was supposed to be my fiercest advocate was a 3-word reduction of my entire future. That night, my father came to my room. He sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the acceptance letter I'd propped against my lamp like a flag. He didn't say much. He rarely did. But he reached into his shirt pocket and took out his old business card. The first one he'd ever had printed, the one from 1987 when he'd started at the company, worn soft at the edges, and he held it out to me. "Nora," he said, "every person who keeps the numbers straight is the person who keeps the lights on. Don't let anyone tell you different." He left before I could answer. He was gone before sunrise the next morning, back on the road. But I put that card in the back of the spiral notebook, behind the last page, and I took the notebook with me to Knoxville. College was the first time I understood what it felt like to be good at something, in a room where people were paying attention to it. My accounting professors didn't care about Garrett. They didn't know my mother. In their classrooms, the only thing that mattered was whether the numbers worked. Mine worked. They worked in ways that other students didn't, which I didn't fully understand at the time. I thought everyone found it this clear, until a professor stopped me after class in my sophomore year and told me I had an unusual ability to see the architecture underneath a financial structure, the load-bearing wall, the places where things would crack under pressure before anyone else noticed the stress. He used that phrase, load-bearing walls. I've thought about it almost every day since. I graduated summa cum laude, passed my CPA exam on the first attempt, worked 4 years at a mid-sized firm in Nashville, and then in 2012 I made a decision that no one in my family understood. I moved to a small city in eastern Tennessee and opened my own practice. Not corporate clients, not the accounts that paid the highest fees. Healthcare, rural healthcare specifically. Clinics that were chronically underfunded, pharmacies that served communities with no other options, health centers operating on grant money and prayer. Nobody in my family asked why. My mother's summary, delivered at Thanksgiving that year, Nora decided to work with small businesses, said in the same tone she'd used to describe someone who had switched careers after a nervous breakdown. What I had actually decided to do was build the financial infrastructure for the kind of healthcare organizations that kept people alive in places where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away. I became the person who could look at a clinic's books and tell them exactly why they were hemorrhaging money and exactly where to apply pressure to stop the bleeding. I built compliance systems that let small health centers survive federal audits. I structured grant accounting for organizations that had never had clean financials before, and, because of it, had never been eligible for the funding they qualified for. In 12 years, my firm worked with 61 healthcare organizations across Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina. 43 of them had been rejected for federal funding before they came to me. 38 received it after. My mother knew none of this, not because I hid it, because she had never once, in 12 years, asked. The night of my brother's party, Garrett had just been named department chief at the hospital where he'd worked for 8 years. It was a genuine accomplishment. I drove 4 hours because I was genuinely proud of him. My brother and I had a relationship that existed in the space my mother hadn't managed to contaminate. Quiet emails, occasional calls, a real tenderness that had survived despite everything. He'd called me personally to ask me to come. I came for him. Delia had arranged everything. The house, the catering, the guest list, which was curated the way Delia curated everything, precisely and with clear awareness of who would photograph well standing next to whom. Constance Briggs was there because Delia and Constance had been building the nonprofit's financing structure together for 2 years. I didn't know Constance was going to be there. I didn't know Constance Briggs at all, or thought I didn't, until I walked into the room and she looked at me with a recognition that I couldn't place. I gave it 2 minutes of thought and let it go. I had a sparkling water. I talked to my brother. I smiled at people whose names I was managing to remember by attaching them to something visual about their faces. Then my mother arrived. She came in the way she always comes into rooms she's been to before, moving through the space like she owns the layout, greeting people by name in a voice pitched to land in adjacent conversations. She'd been to Garrett and Delia's house enough times that she had what I can only describe as territorial ease. She kissed Delia on both cheeks. She shook hands with people she'd met before. She worked the room with the efficiency of someone who has spent decades understanding that a party is a resource to be managed. She found me near the kitchen doorway. Her eyes moved over me in that way she had, not unkind, just cataloging. Blazer, yes. Sparkling water, not wine. Alone. Then she turned to the room and to Delia, who had come to stand beside her, and that was when she said it. She spent 30 years building something real. Her hand on Delia's shoulder, the crowd orienting itself toward her voice. And then there's Nora. I watched Constance Briggs's face change. She was standing 12 feet away, near the fireplace, in a gray blazer, and she had been in the middle of saying something to the man next to her when my name landed in the room that way. She stopped. She turned. Her eyes found me. Her expression did something I'd seen before. The specific look of a person whose mental files have suddenly rearranged themselves around a piece of information they hadn't expected to encounter in this context. She excused herself from the man she'd been talking to and walked toward me. My mother was still in the middle of her performance. She'd moved on to a specific anecdote about Delia's TEDx talk, which she had attended and could describe in detail, down to the color of Delia's blazer and the moment the audience began to lean forward. She was doing this for the cluster of guests nearest her. Nobody was talking to me. Nobody was supposed to. Constance stopped in front of me. She said, "Are you Nora Danforth?" I said yes. She said, "The Nora Danforth who restructured the grant compliance system for Blue Ridge Community Health?" I said yes. She said, "I've been trying to find out who did that work for 2 years." The room around us went quiet in a different way than my mother had intended. Constance Briggs was not someone who spoke loudly. She had the particular quietness of people who have spent decades in rooms where speaking softly meant the room reorganized itself to hear you. But the question she asked next carried to every corner of that living room as clearly as if she'd used a microphone. "Do you know," she said, looking at me with an expression that was flat and direct and entirely without performance, "that the compliance model your firm built for Blue Ridge is being used as the federal template for rural health center grant accounting in 4 states? I felt something shift in the room. Not noise, the opposite. A particular quality of stillness. My mother stopped talking mid-sentence. If you've ever watched someone lose control of a room they've spent years owning, the first sign is always the same. It's not anger. It's the half-second pause where they realize the room is no longer reading from their script. Her smile didn't disappear. It just stopped having any connection to what was happening behind her eyes. Constance didn't look at her. She looked at me. "Our nonprofit has been working with the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy for the last 18 months on a standardized accounting framework for small health centers," she said. The framework they kept pointing us back to, the one that already existed, the one they said nobody needed to reinvent because someone had already done it right, was yours, your firm's model, built out of your office in Tennessee. I heard someone set a glass down on a hard surface. The sound was very distinct in that quiet. I said, "I didn't know it had traveled that far. It's in 14 clinics in Tennessee, 8 in Kentucky, and it's been formally adopted by the North Carolina Rural Health Commission," she said. "We've been trying to track down the source for months. The clinics just call it the Danforth system." The Danforth system. I had not known that name existed. I have kept numbers my entire professional life. I have built frameworks and filed compliance reports and stayed up past midnight more times than I can count working through grant accounting that nobody would ever see my name on. That is the nature of the work. The work is invisible, which is exactly what makes it structural. Walls are invisible until something hits them. My father used to say, "The person who keeps the number straight keeps the lights on." He said it once. I carried it for 24 years. My mother had moved one step to her left. She did it without appearing to. The way she made all her adjustments, as if rearranging for comfort rather than repositioning for control. But I had been watching her rearrange rooms my entire life, and I saw exactly what that step cost her. Constance turned to address the room, not in a performative way, but in the way a person does when they realize the room has become relevant to what they're saying. "I work in nonprofit healthcare financing," she said. "I've spent 20 years in this field. The technical problem of keeping small health centers financially viable, keeping them audit clean, keeping them eligible for federal funding, keeping them from closing, is one of the hardest structural problems in American healthcare. Most people in my world don't even know there's a solution. This is the person who built one." She looked at me. "I'm sorry to do this at a dinner party, but I've been carrying this around for 2 years and I'd like to shake your hand." She extended her hand. I shook it. From across the room, I heard my aunt say something in a low voice. I didn't catch the words. I caught the tone, The tone of someone whose understanding of the room has just been forcibly updated and who hasn't yet decided how to arrange their face around the new information. My mother said nothing. For the first time in my memory, she said nothing. The man she'd been performing for, one of Garrett's colleagues, an orthopedic surgeon I'd been introduced to earlier, turned from her toward me, the way people turn in a current when the current shifts direction. He said, "I'm sorry, the Danforth system, is that what they've been piloting at the federally qualified health centers upstate?" Constance said, "It is." He looked at me differently. The specific look of a person's recalibrating an assessment they'd already filed away as complete. I want to tell you that I felt triumph. That I felt the clean satisfaction of a movie moment, the kind where the music swells and the camera pushes in, and the person who was wronged finally gets to collect. I want to tell you that because it would be a cleaner story. But what I actually felt was older than triumph. It was the feeling of something that had been held tight for a very long time finally being allowed to open. Not joy, release. I thought about the spiral notebook behind the winter sweaters, the third stair from the bottom that didn't creak, the phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. Some girls are just meant to support the people who do the real work. I had supported, all right, 61 organizations, 38 federal funding approvals, 14 states' worth of clinics that stayed open and kept their lights on because the numbers were right. My brother appeared at my side, Garrett. He had that look he got when he was processing something that didn't fit inside a category he'd already built. A slight squint, a tightness around the jaw. He put his hand briefly on my back, the way he'd done when we were kids and something happened that neither of us knew how to name. He said quietly, just to me, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I should have asked." That hit differently than anything else in the room. He was right, he should have asked. He hadn't asked because he'd grown up in the same house I had, absorbing the same architecture of attention, and it had shaped his assumptions about what was worth asking about the same way it shaped everything else. He knew it, the squint, the jaw, the hand on my back, he knew it. I said, "You're asking now." That was enough. My mother had reorganized herself. I could see it happening from across the room the way I could always see her adjustments, the straightening of the spine, the resettlement of expression into something that could be read as gracious if you weren't looking closely. She was making her way toward me through the party. Not directly. My mother never moved directly toward anything she intended to address. She moved diagonally, which gave her time to arrive already having composed whatever she planned to say. She arrived with the version of her smile that she used when conceding something she didn't believe in. "Well," she said, "I didn't realize how far your work had traveled." 5 words, each one chosen to contain the least possible acknowledgement while appearing to offer something. I didn't realize. Not I was wrong. Not I never asked. The passive construction, realization as a thing that simply hadn't happened to her yet, not a failure of attention or interest or love, just an information gap, unfortunate, now addressed. I looked at her. I had been looking at her my whole life, trying to find in her face the version of a mother I'd needed, the one who asked questions, the one who assumed that something worth asking about existed, the one who might have driven to Tennessee once to see where I worked, who might have sat across from me at the beige desk with the window and said, "Show me what you do, I want to understand it." That version had never existed. I'd spent 30 years looking for her in the face of a woman who had never once considered she might be missing something by not looking. I didn't feel rage. I'd passed rage sometime in my mid-30s, somewhere between the 4th unanswered question about my firm and the 3rd holiday dinner, where my mother recited Garrett's professional accomplishments like a liturgy and asked me if I was keeping busy. What I felt now was the particular clarity that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone to become something they have no capacity to be. I spoke at a normal volume. I didn't need to perform this. The room was already listening. "You've been to 14 of Garrett's hospital events in the last 4 years," I said. "You've attended 2 of his award ceremonies. You drove to Nashville when he was promoted to associate chief." I kept my voice even, not cold, just factual, the way a ledger is factual. "In 12 years, you have never once visited my office. You've never asked me to explain what I do or who I do it for. You've never inquired about a single client or a single outcome. You've been to Tennessee twice to see Garrett and Delia's friends. You have never come to see me." I let that sit. "I didn't need you to understand what I do to know that it was worth doing," I said. "But I want you to understand right now, clearly, the work I have done is not a support role. It is the reason 61 healthcare organizations in 3 states are still open and still serving patients. Some of them in counties where I am the reason a clinic exists at all. You can call that background noise if you want to. But background noise doesn't get named a federal template." My mother's mouth was closed. Her chin had lifted the half-inch it lifted when she was maintaining composure under conditions she hadn't anticipated. I said, "I love you. And I am done explaining myself to you. I held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then I turned, set my sparkling water on the bookshelf nearest me, walked to my brother, hugged him, told him I was proud of him, and meant every word of it. I did not slam a door. I did not deliver a final line to the room. I got my coat from the guest room, where the coats were piled on the bed, said goodbye to Constance Briggs, and gave her my card, and walked out through the front door into a November night in Tennessee that was cold and clear and smelled like leaves. I drove 2 hours before I stopped at a rest area and sat in the car in the dark, not because I was crying, because I needed the stillness. In my line of work, I have sat with a lot of organizations at the moment when they realize their numbers have been telling a story they weren't reading. There's a particular look that comes over people in that moment, not devastation. Something quieter. The look of someone who has just seen the load-bearing wall they didn't know was there, and understood, all at once, what it had been holding up. I thought about my father's business card in the back of the notebook. I thought about the phrase he'd said once and never repeated because he was a man who believed a thing said once was enough. The person who keeps the numbers straight keeps the lights on. He'd been dead for 6 years. Pancreatic cancer, fast and without much warning, the way it often is. I'd been with him at the end, which Garrett had not been. He'd been at a conference and didn't get there in time, which was a grief he still carried and that I had never once used against him. My father's last conscious words to me were not dramatic. They were not the kind of thing you'd write on a headstone or put at the end of a movie. He looked at me and said, "Are the accounts in order?" He was asking about his own financial accounts. He was a practical man. I said, "Everything is in order." He said, "Good." That was the last conversation we had. I drove to the cemetery the next morning before my flight home. The November light was thin and flat, and the grass was wet from overnight frost. My father's grave was under an oak tree he hadn't chosen. He'd had no opinions about his burial arrangements and left the decision to us. But I had chosen the oak because it was the largest tree in that section, and I had the sense, irrational and persistent, that he would have approved of something solid. I stood in front of the headstone. My hands were cold. I am not a person who talks to graves as a general rule. I find it creates a performance out of something that should be quiet. But I needed to say one thing out loud before I left. 38 organizations funded, I said. 61 still open. The numbers are straight. The oak overhead shifted. Leaves moved. The cold pressed in. I pressed my palm flat against the headstone. The granite was colder than the air. Cold in the specific way of surfaces that have been absorbing darkness for a long time. I stayed there for a while. Not because the moment required it. Because he had been a man who deserved unhurried time, and I had not always given him enough of it. When I left, I walked back to my car with a feeling I hadn't expected. Not emptiness, not grief, but something closer to a foundation settling. The feeling of a structure that has been under load for a long time finally being allowed to stand on its own. I did not look back. Back home, a week after the party, my brother called. Not to relay anything my mother had said. Not to mediate, not to smooth, not to ask me to consider her perspective. He called because he wanted to know about my firm. He asked me to explain it to him, the work, really explain it, from the beginning. He asked how I decided to focus on healthcare. He asked what the hardest case had been. He asked what I was working on now. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. At the end of the call, he said, "I should have been asking you this stuff for years." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." That was the apology that mattered. Not the one in the living room from a woman who had decided that a 30-year failure of attention was a misunderstanding too small to name properly. The apology from the person who saw what he'd missed, named it exactly, and didn't try to negotiate down the size of it. My mother called 11 days after the party. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message once. She did not apologize. She said she'd been thinking, and that she had always wanted good things for me, and that she hoped I knew that. She said she thought the party had gotten a little heated, and she hoped feelings weren't lasting. Feelings weren't lasting. The way you'd describe an unfortunate weather event. I did not call her back. Not that day, not the next. I made myself no promise about when or whether I would. That was a question I was going to answer on a timeline that belonged to me, informed by a set of considerations that had nothing to do with what she needed from me or when she needed it. That was the difference between 20 years ago and now. 20 years ago, the voicemail would have sat in my chest like a stone until I called back. Because I still had enough of the child in me who thought there was something she could do to change the ledger. Now I understood. The way you understand a number that finally balances, that some accounts were never going to come out even. Not because the math was wrong, but because one party had been entering false figures from the beginning. You can't reconcile a statement built on false entries. You close the period, you open a new one, and you carry only what's real. I am Nora Danforth. I am 41 years old. I run a firm in Eastern Tennessee that has kept 61 healthcare organizations financially viable in communities where the nearest alternative is nowhere. I built a compliance model that now has my last name on it in 4 states and that I didn't know existed until a woman at a dinner party told me in front of my mother. My mother spent 30 years deciding I was background noise. She was right about one thing. I have always worked in the background, in the walls, in the structures that hold everything up before anyone notices they need holding. The difference between background noise and a load-bearing wall is simple. One of them you can remove.